Ah, the ranger, paragon of the wilds, lord of the hunt, master of beasts, lord of dragons, dual-wielding sword master, empowering leader, incredible archer, master tracker, and so on and so forth. I've been thinking of rangers a lot lately, and I've come to a truly troubling conclusion. I don't think we know what rangers are. Now I hear you, dear viewer. Don't be crazy, Puck. Of course we know what rangers are. And to you I say, do we? Do we really? Allow me to explain my thought process. While I was writing the script for my last video, I was digging into rangers' abilities and traits. And what I found is that rangers are just kind of a mess. They seem trapped in some kind of purgatory between being a martial class and a spellcasting class. It's the only class that doesn't learn spellcasting till level 2 without some kind of subclass selection being involved. It's just kind of a mess. And when I read the details about the 1D&D Ranger changes, I found them to be supremely underwhelming as well. Okay, great, you don't have to concentrate on Hunter's Mark anymore, and you don't have to use a spell slot. Ooh, this is a lot of work for 1d6 of extra damage when a rogue is getting 2d6 at the same range just by having somebody else start the fight. Can we just agree that Hunter's Mark should just be an ability that rangers get instead of it being a spell? I think Vengeance Paladins can live without it. But I'm not here to discuss ranger mechanics and changes, at least not today. My point is that rangers as a class seem very confused overall, and I started to think and ask around about other ranger classes that people have played in other games, tabletop and video. For example, in World of Warcraft, hunters were a total mess, with talent trees that focused on melee, traps, and beast masteries as well as ranged attacks, with each specialization making the character feel somewhat incomplete in terms of abilities, forcing most characters to work with a kind of amalgamation of all the talent trees, not focusing on any one. This, of course, was just the easiest example that came to mind, and by this point I started to notice a bit of a trend with the various rangers and ranger-like classes. They all seem to have a bit of an identity crisis. They were supposed to be ranged or martial classes, weapons masters or spellcasters, fighter druids, trackers and beastmasters, all of the above. It seems to me that most ranger builds were trying to be too many things at once without a singular focus. This is where I began to notice that there seems to be a lot of differing opinions as far as what a ranger actually is and what a character needs to have to be considered a ranger. And this is what leads me to believe that we don't actually know. But let's start from scratch. Let's take a look at all the things we know about rangers. Okay, so from the abilities and spells given to rangers in 5th edition, we can come up with a few key traits that rangers are supposed to embody. So, rangers, according to the information and build options in the player's handbook, are magical, casting spells similar to druids by channeling natural magics. They're skilled fighters who prefer to travel alone and favor natural environments over civilization. When it comes to favored weapons, I'm going to say something very controversial here. Rangers favor ranged weapons. I know, I can hear you in the comments already. Give me a moment, we will come back to this. Rangers frequently have animal companions, and some kind of way to reach out to allies in nature. Lastly, rangers are skilled hunters and trackers. I realize I may have just said a few controversial things, and I want you to bear with me. All will be explained in time. So, we have our ranger traits. These 5 basic points make up what we imagine as a ranger when it comes to D&D. And now let's compare them to arguably the 2 most famous fantasy fiction rangers, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings and Drizzt Do'Urden from the Forgotten Realms series. These 2 will serve as our comparisons to what a ranger should be, with Aragorn serving as the core fantasy non-Dungeons & Dragons representation, and Drizzt serving as the in-world Dungeons & Dragons analog. Let's start with Aragorn. Aragorn, the one true king, the leader of the Fellowship, and all-time champion Gimli tosser. The first thing we learn about Aragorn is that he is a ranger. He is one of the only characters specifically assigned such a role beyond Gandalf, who is a wizard. So what do we know about Aragorn the Ranger? Now, Aragorn does operate on his own as far as we know until he finds his way into the Fellowship of the Ring, and then he's ride or die with his new elf and dwarf bros. So I guess partial credit, because we can assume that he became lonely enough over the years to just become BFFs with the first 4 dudes that came along. Imagine that comes with years of farting around in the bush on your own. Aragorn does not know any magic of any kind. That being said, very few people know magic in The Lord of the Rings, so that could be a product of the environment. Maybe Aragorn is a Dark Sun Ranger. Hunting and tracking, he does do a bit of hunting and tracking, although it's more prominent in the books than it is for the movie, but there are many stories of Aragorn's renowned tracking skills. Kinship with nature, at no point does he exhibit any kind of kinship with nature or animals. Nothing to show that he is closely joined with the natural world. He has a very good horse, and that's about it. Finally, we have preferred weapons. And again, calm down, we will get to it. Aragorn uses swords and daggers as his primary weapons. Now, I realize he does own a bow, but he uses it rarely at best. I scanned through all 3 movies and found him using his bow only once. If you would like to argue that his bow is a primary weapon, I could equally argue that Gimli is one of his primary weapons because he uses him just as much. As far as animal companions, again, unless you count one very good horse, like everyone has a horse, so I don't think it counts. It's really nothing special, it's not a defining characteristic. Okay, so, Aragorn. Number 1 ranger of the Tolkien lore, matches a total of 2 out of 5 defining characteristics. Now, surely, the hero of Icewind Dale, Drizzt, will score better as arguably the most famous Dungeons & Dragons canon lore ranger. Okay, first step. Does Drizzt know magic? Nope, not at all. Drizzt can cast 2 spells, Darkness and Fairy Fire. But those are racial abilities that come from him being a drow, so no points. Skilled fighter who favors nature? Absolutely. I've spent 20 books with Drizzt, and at this point, he can never sit still in civilization for too long. 1 point. Favored weapons. Drizzt is famous for his dual scimitars. He is known throughout for his dual scimitars. This has always been his main weapon. When people describe him, they describe him as a drow with 2 scimitars. Animal companions. This is another controversial one. Now, Drizzt famously has an animal friend, a giant black panther known as Guinevere. However, I argue, and I welcome the static and the debate from this, Guinevere is a magical item. She is bound to an onyx figurine that Drizzt possesses, and while they do share a deep bond, their companionship has more to do with the fact that Guinevere is bound to a magical item than it has to do with Drizzt's abilities as a ranger. I say 0 points. It's got nothing to do with him being a ranger. Skilled hunter and tracker? Absolutely. Frequently scouts and spots for his party, constantly known as the party tracker. 1 point. So that's 2 points for Drizzt as well. Now that we have our scores, and before we go further over the results in greater detail, we need to talk about weapons. Now, look, rangers are proficient with a lot of weapons. You can pick between archery, defense, dueling, and 2-weapon fighting skills when you reach level 2. But why would you pick anything other than archery? The bulk of the ranger spells are built to help you either put distance between you and your enemies or empower your ranged attacks. And look, I firmly believe there's no wrong way to build a character in D&D. If you want to flavor your ranger to have a sword and shield, all the power to you. But at the end of the day, that's all it is flavor. Every other weapon/fighting style that the ranger can use is done better by other classes in a substantial way. It's like shoveling your driveway with a dessert spoon. Certainly you could do it, given enough time and effort, but there's an easier way to get where you're going. On top of that, every single picture you find of the ranger class, they're holding a bow. And why wouldn't they? They want to use great spells like Cordon of Arrows, Hail of Thorns, or Conjure Barrage, or Lightning Arrow. And so it just kind of makes sense. If you don't like bows, you could get the same effect with a thrown weapon. Now, when we take all this information, we begin to notice a key disparity between player character version of Rangers and the literary versions of Rangers. An interesting development when you consider that one of our examples is supposed to be the version of the Dungeons & Dragons Ranger. Our literary Ranger is a skilled blade fighter with impressive tracking skills at their core. They are warriors, while our player characters are more ranged, specialized magical wardens. So let's call them Warrior Ranger and Warden Ranger, respectively. So how did we end up with these two variations of the Ranger? And which one of them more perfectly exemplifies what it means to be a Ranger? I think we can derive a few things by digging into these, and perhaps find our answer as to what a Ranger truly is, as well as shed some light on how the current state of Rangers came to be. See, in the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, the Ranger was a subclass of the fighter. When you take that into account, Drizzt and Aragorn start to make a lot more sense. They make more sense as a fighter subclass focused on tracking and survival. Their inability to cast spells or commune with nature makes a lot more sense if they're a fighter subclass. The Ranger character that we know now are the evolution of turning the Ranger into its own independent class from the fighter class. However, rather than build a new Ranger class from scratch, it seems the decision has been made to simply graft new traits onto the Ranger until it was different enough from its original form to be considered a new class. And it's here that we arrive at the crux of the issue. The Ranger class is much like an old car that has been modded out over the years, but somehow has never had its inner workings changed. So despite its new trappings, it still runs like a fighter, even though truly that is no longer its purpose. Knowing these things, we return to the original question. Do we know what Rangers are? And the answer seems clear. We don't know what a Ranger is, because it seems that we're still figuring out what we would like a Ranger to be. I'd like to return to World of Warcraft for a moment. Remember the Hunter class? It was a complete mess for many years, until a drastic step was taken. They removed ranged weapon proficiencies from other classes, and removed melee weapon proficiencies from hunters. The hunters got better. They became unique in their specialization in ranged weaponry. And I think this is a good lesson for Dungeons & Dragons developers. The changes to the Ranger class have always preserved its core as a fighter subclass. And as a result, with the multitude of things added and taken away from it over the years, the Ranger class has lacked something that makes it truly unique, like a sneak attack, or key points, or tons of extra attacks, or rage, and so on. And no, Hunter's Mark does not count. God, what a sad fucking spell that is. God, don't get me started on Hunter's Mark. So, at the end of the day, Rangers are messed up because there seems to be this urge to cling to the past, threading a delicate string between what Rangers were when they originally made and what we plan for them to be now. Perhaps it's best to think about rebuilding the Ranger class from the ground up and making it truly unique amongst other classes. And I have a few ideas about that. And if you want to hear them, like and comment on this video. If it gets a lot of traction, maybe I'll make another one breaking down the ways I think the Ranger class could be rebuilt. But for now, thanks for watching, and Puck out.